Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last session entitled Rapporteur Remarks. What this session is just a kind of light wrap-up of the conference, some reflections from the junior fellows who are all seated to my left, and myself, who organized this conference. And so what we did is we took notes throughout the conference on things that were emerging for us, questions we had, and then we just wanted to have a kind of informal conversation. And this is going to be a little bit more participatory in the sense that if you do have questions throughout, feel free to raise your hands and we can just kind of loop in the audience that way rather than having a formal Q&A at the end. As well as, we're not the policy experts that we're the panelists. We just have reflections. And so what we wanted to do was kind of break it down into the various panels that we saw. So we're going to talk first about the panel 1, so setting the stakes, and then about academic experiences, do a little gloss on the keynote, and then finally talk about the policymaker perspectives. So one of the first things that I thought was really interesting was the initial disagreement between Peter Lowen and his colleagues. And then one of the things that came up that I thought was really interesting was this moral obligation on the part of professors to their students in terms of engaging students in democratic education and kind of cultivating certain moral values in relation to the state. What do we think about that? Do you feel as though your professors should have a kind of a moral obligation to engage on that axis with you? And I'll start with my answer, but just so you have time to prepare. Because I don't know, to some degree, like I wonder, like if a professor is trained to do that. Like, is that what their capacities are? And it's not to say that, I don't trust my professors with that kind of thing, but it is a little bit of a concern of mine that I would wonder, like, is the university as an institution capacious enough to kind of set up a professor to do that kind of work, especially with how diverse institutions are and the diverse goals of different students, right? So I wonder if students would have the room to kind of sit back from a certain kind of moral education that's being professed if there was a kind of institutionalization of moral education vis-a-vis government relations or public policy. So I'm just wondering what other people think about that.
I think George Follis actually talked about this in one of his books about the original purpose of the university. They were originally set up to, prepare students to become good citizens and to be good people. So I think that, we've kind of, not fallen from grace, so to speak, but, universities have definitely evolved since then to have many different roles in students' lives. And I think maybe Alison can contribute to this. But the rise of what we call in higher education the vocationalization of higher education, where the universities are now expected to prepare students for the workforce and not necessarily to prepare them to be good citizens, is something that I was thinking about throughout this symposium.
Okay, so my thoughts, and I want to go back to the initial disagreement when you said universities aren't built for anything else. And
right.
If I was to just use an academic, quote someone, and in higher education, the first thing we learn is Newman's writing about higher education, and where he was very influential in this field, and he mentioned something about the fact that universities should exist for the fact that just to educate students and for nothing else. They don't have any other role, and this was probably 1500s, or it's really far away. So I think the university has evolved considerably. So while, yes, it's not built exactly in the sense like it doesn't have an incentive structure, it has your tenure, you need to publish, that's all we know. If you want to get into academia, you need to publish and teach. But it has evolved, I would say, to take on greater roles in the sense that it now looks at the communities that it works in and how best it can support the communities around it, whether it's urban planning, whether it's pharmacy, healthcare. So I will say that, do we need to consider why researchers need to get into policy? And I think getting back to your question about morals, I would just ask, what do we mean by morals? Whose morals are we talking about? Because if you have conflict, there are two sides of the conflict, right? So where's my moral compass going to point to me? So I would just question those things.
Right, and I think that's a good question because it does point to a little bit of what I was saying around the diversity of institutions today, and especially in Canada, because that's the context we're speaking from. Like University of Toronto is a gigantic institution trying to serve as many students as it holds, but I think that if you deliver a kind of moral education that is top down rather than bottom up, and I'm not even sure how bottom up moral education would work, I think you run the risk of kind of an oppression of morals, like kind of inculcating morals into students that function in odd power relations that the students don't exactly have full capacity over. And I think one thing that I realized we forgot to do is introduce ourselves. And so I think that's probably, we should just run it back a little bit and speak a little bit of just who we are and what just our background is, like what we're studying, just to kind of ground the responses that we're going to give. Because, you know, I'm no public policy expert. My name is Noah, and I'm a PhD student in social justice education, and I don't even study education as an institution. I study the education of artificial intelligence. So it's a very different kind of education. And part of that work is philosophical, and so that's kind of my interest that I come to this with, and so that's why the piece on morals was immediately struck my attention. And to the left of me is...
My name is Mina, and I am a second-year Master of Global Affairs student at the Monk School. At the Monk School, I'm specializing in security and innovation.
Alrighty. I'm Setayesh. I'm a third-year pharmacy student at UFD.
Hi everyone. My name is Margaret, but you can call me Margie. I am a first-year PhD student in higher education at OISE at the University of Toronto, and my research interests are in access and affordability to higher education for historically underrepresented groups from an international comparative perspective. So I'm specifically interested in the US and Canada.
Hi, so I'm Alison. I am a second-year PhD student in higher education, and my research looks into academic capitalism and its impact on influences on women in male-dominated fields of study, and I'm going to take a couple of countries and look into the study.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. And I just wanted to kind of now run back to where we were. Just connect both of your thoughts, Margie and Alison. I think one of the concepts that George Follis writes about is multiversities. And there's a book on multiversities and the kind of expanding role of universities over time to take on multiple missions. And when I think about it in my head, it's almost like a belt that keeps expanding because the thing is getting weightier and weightier. And I'm wondering how much it can hold. And this is not to say that, you know, public policy doesn't have a place in the institution, but I'm trying to figure out where it fits. And that to me has always been a difficult conversation because one would have to say something fits in the institution, right? Like the institution is for a given thing. And I think that's the point at which you become almost too definitive around what the institution is, because you might lock it into a certain kind of understanding. And within all of those kind of expanding roles, one of which that was talked about was the incentive structure. You know, the professorial kind of tenure track and how it's set up and what professors are rewarded for. But what was not talked about was the kind of graduate student reward structure, which makes sense because the panelists were coming from a certain perspective. And so I'm wondering from the panelists, or I guess the rapporteurs, do you think that you're incentivized to engage in public policy within your programs? Because I know that when I think about, okay, I want an academic position after my PhD, where does that show up on my CV? You know what I mean? Like this really kind of material, metrics-based thinking when you're trying to think about what am I going to be assessed on? To me, it's papers. You know, did I write as many research articles as I could? And so that's kind of my understanding that although I would love to engage in public policy more, I'm just not sure how I derive value from it, given the track that I'm on. So I'd like to hear from just kind of everybody about your experiences with engaging with public policy in your program.
Yeah, I guess I can start. I think that if I was on the public policy side of the monk school, I probably would be engaging more closely with public policy. I personally am not, but there are a lot of opportunities for students who are interested, and especially for students who want to have a career in the Ontario Public Service. There are different ways of doing this, and even beyond that, the monk school offers different opportunities like case competitions, which is a way to kind of hone in your skills in this area. So I do think that the monk school does an incredible job when it comes to that. I personally just wasn't interested in engaging in it.
I think because I'm in healthcare and it's a regulated profession, our main role is to become healthcare professionals. So there is regulation from the colleges that, for example, for us, it's the Ontario College of Pharmacists. So the policies that impact our work, yes, there's some federal policies like the Controlled Substances Act we're talking about, or at the reimbursement policies within Ontario, or more recently for us, for example, the fact that pharmacists now, the policy has allowed us to be able to prescribe for minor ailments. So policy impacts our work also as training. The moment that policy was implemented, now part of our training in the school had to be updated, meaning that they have to train us to be able to also prescribe, right, for minor ailments. So what happens is that we're the end users usually of the policy, so policy impacts us. I think our program does a good job in terms of educating us about policy because they implemented health systems courses that basically teaches us about how the Canadian healthcare system works and how the Ontario healthcare system works. And I think the expectation that they have from us is to understand it. I think the objective of the program you're talking about, my program is to make sure that we are trained, competent pharmacists going out there in the world practicing. I don't think the goal of the program we have would be to make us people that can engage with policy. However, I think that the onus falls on the students. If, for example, we want to engage with policy, there are clubs, student clubs. We have professors that do policy work. For example, Dr. Tadros in the second panel, he does a lot of policy work. So I was able to work with him and do some research. So there are opportunities for us to be exposed, but it's really more like if you're interested. And more it's about, do you understand at a basic level, what are the policies out there that can impact your work as a pharmacist? And I'm really speaking about my field. But yeah, the programs are not trained in such a way for us to make sure that we can engage with policy. Yeah, it's more like understanding it, how it impacts us. Yeah.
I think with the PhD program, there's a lot of flexibility, and it really depends on your goals after your doctoral program. I know personally, I would like to go into a tenure track position, so I definitely would prioritize more traditional methods of demonstrating my academic excellence, and engaging in public policy doesn't normally lend itself well to that. But I have, but it really depends on your goals. A lot of people in my program do wish to become policymakers and influence policy after their doctorates, so they're more engaged in writing op-eds or working in the government while they're completing their doctorate. So it really depends on your goals after the PhD. I think my opinion would be that there should be a role of for public scholarship in both the hiring of tenure track positions and the tenure review. I think that mobilizing and translating your research and making sure it has a tangible impact on the real world should be an important component of our role as academics. Yeah, so I personally have been engaged a lot in podcasts and blogs and things like that, and I completed a policy internship at the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, where I did policy research, so I'm regularly engaged in that. But yeah, it really just depends, and I think Alison will probably mirror my sentiments as well.
Yeah, so does it matter? The short answer is not as much as it should. And I'll go back a little bit. I have to prepare a CV once I graduate, not a resume. Again, it depends on your program. You have practice-based programs and then you have research-based programs. So if I want to get into academia, I have to publish, I have to teach. Small component of service. As a graduate student, if I want to apply for awards, I have to list a bunch of things. If I was to engage in policy, let's take an example in terms of like, and I do that, like working on a report for HECO, right? That is not considered as a valid research contribution the way a published article would be. Yeah. And if anyone who's filled out a SHRC application will know there's like research peer-reviewed, because it's not primarily peer-reviewed. So as graduate students, we have one major problem, and that's time. Where do you devote your time? Yes, we want to engage in policy. No researcher doesn't want to engage in policy, because if they have to talk about their work, that's the first thing that they want to do, because we all are in it, because we strongly feel that this particular area has something that can make a difference, that can make things better, and we have that expertise because we've spent so much of time researching about it. So we would love to have that impact on a wider scale as opposed to the 3 people that will have to read my thesis. But if you're not going to prioritize that in terms of whether I get awards as a graduate student, to the same extent which you would prioritize me writing this one journal article that will be read with this really small group of elites, because not everyone reads those journals or can even afford to access those journals, then why would I really want to get into policy? Well, like, what's the incentive for me?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the... Yeah.
Just one point on this.
Oh, sorry. Let me give you the mic.
Okay.
We'll keep this one out.
Yeah, no, just a very interesting discussion, but just to be clear, because you're talking about impacts on public policy and so on, within your careers and your academic streams, and that's a bit of the debate that we're having here. But you've already mentioned it before, but I can say this again. You're also still citizens. You're bright young men and women who want a better society and a better country. And therefore, you can volunteer for NGOs, you can join the groups that you're more interested in, you could try to elect people, there's a whole range of activities you can do as democratic citizens, which don't per se affect your academic credentials and careers. So I wouldn't want anyone on the YouTube audience or so on to say, well, everyone is putting their academic credential over the better society, because lots of people do both. They work as researchers and they get the articles done and they try to build their university career, but they're active like crazy on the issues that move them most, using all the skills that they have learned through their advanced training. So it's not an either or. There's also a democratic citizen aspect, of which I'm sure you all make a contribution to.
We'll leave that one out with you, and then if anyone has a question, you can kind of pass it to them. I think that your point is well taken, and I think that one of the things that Alison mentioned was the various like time constraints on graduate student life, and so it's more about, I guess, kind of finding the right balance, like determining how much of my time should I be spending on this academic piece, and then where can I fill in the public policy piece. And I think time also opens us up well to talk about panel 2, because one of the things that Carolyn mentioned was windows of opportunity, that time seemed to function really importantly in the public policy conversation, because there are only certain windows where you're going to be able to engage as effectively as you might want to. And when you have limited time, that's probably how you want to use your time, as effectively as possible. And so I'm wondering, I guess, with respect to the constraints you feel that you have as a graduate student, in terms of where your time goes, how do you balance, thinking about public policy versus thinking about kind of, your more like quote unquote academic work? Not to draw a dichotomy between the two, but as far as you can, where do you see the balance being struck, or how do you go about determining that? And this could go to anybody. Or if you want to redirect the conversation, that's totally okay too.
I think being a pharmacy student, because you posed it as a grad student, I think on a day-to-day basis, like I think in our training, we come across problems that like I think for our training, it's like our health system has. So when I'm reading about the problem that people have with, let's say, accessing pain medication and the problem that our country has with like opioids, like there are policies that directly impact that. So when I'm reading about that, it's just part of the course that is focused on pain management. But like my mind is already engaged about the policy aspect. I think there's like one point is like, we're like at the initial stages of our training, right? So I think for me to really enter that space, like the first thing that is needed is me completing this program and then going through the training and a residency and getting into the workforce. And yes, from the outside and from the internships or the opportunities that have been given, I can get a sense of that, but I feel like we almost like need to be humble in a way to say that we are really new to this. It's good to be interested and be curious and be involved in discussions and panel like this and talk to people that have been in policy, but more in like from a learner's perspective. Because I feel like 10 years from today, if we all talk to each other, we'd be in different places. And with our experience and a scope of practice that we've gained, we'll probably have better reach, better impact. So I feel like how I'm viewing my training right now is like I'm a learner. So let me learn as much as I can and be a sponge. And when I'm exposed to people that work in policy, let me just ask them about how they do it. So today, for example, the entire point's about coming up about how like scientific research is so hard to understand sometimes, and the academic language, and you have to be able to communicate. So I feel like these are all, like today, our engagement with this panel discussion, I think is a good starting point for us because we've already talked to a few people that are in this field. So I look at it this way, more of like being curious and being keen and want to learn from policymakers or people that have been in the policy world.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I don't think it needs to be like an either or, like with the times constraints. I think, I guess thinking about my own research, it's very much tied to policy. I examine financial aid policy as part of my research. So engaging with like actual tangible policies is part of my work. So I don't know if it necessarily has to be like either or, but it really, I guess, depends. I guess that's my answer. I don't have to choose, but I don't know. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think it did. And I think another thing that was important, at least that I noted, was the idea of the media as mediator between the academy and the university and the government. And I think that's a difficult place to navigate as a graduate student when you're thinking about kind of how I want to kind of make my impact, because there's a whole set of skills, like media skills, like how to write an op-ed or how to write a letter to the editor or that kind of thing, that come into play, and so I'm wondering how you all feel around kind of engaging with the media. Is that something you feel prepared to do, or what's your experience with kind of media engagement, or if you have done that successfully, what did that look like?
Okay, do you want to say something?
Just a short point. I think one of the points that Glenn made in the keynote was about the politicization of your research when you do engage in public policy, and how you can kind of lose control of the narrative of your research when it is kind of, when it enters the media arena. And I think I haven't had a lot of experience with disseminating my research through media, but I think that's one of the things that I would be reserved about if I become an academic and want to really engage with the media with my work, because you don't know how people will perceive it and how people will receive it, and kind of misconstrue things. So yeah, I think that's one of the things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also need to realize that we're not experts yet. Mm-hmm. We have knowledge, but we don't know everything. And so I think for me, I always think about the fact that, am I ready to give my opinion on something which people might read? And, I don't want it's definitely going to be biased because I'm a human being and, we have our biases. So I don't necessarily, like, do I write? Yes, I do write, but I write more to magazines where I feel comfortable, which are education focused. And I think that I start small and scale up. We aren't really trained in terms of, like, the consequences of, how it can be used. And I think that's a process, and that's an experience that we need to go through. And you'll learn, right? Again, it depends on whether you feel ready enough, or whether you know how to do it, or put it in simple language, so that people can really get what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Margie said about kind of the co-option of one's work, because I think that for me, like, if I'm honest, like, I've been quite scared to engage with public policy, not in any material way, but like there's a kind of concern that, like, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing here, like it's this giant, like, megalith, like somewhere that exists, and I'm not sure, like, the material kind of avenues to engage in it until, and I think this opens us up to maybe panel 3, where David Zimmer was talking about the boardroom, and I just loved that material example of, you get the phone call from the Prime Minister, you drive, maybe you take transit to the boardroom, you enter the room, probably some security protocols, and then, these people are around you, and then you're being trained by, the public service, and it almost felt like an educational moment, that it was like the construction of a classroom, like how a kid goes to school, which I really liked about that, and I was wondering, like, kind of what are the things that you feel would, I guess, familiarize yourself with public policy? Like, what do you feel like you don't know after today's conference?
I just can say I can say what I do know, and that's because of my experience working with the OPS. It's that it's easier said than done, and I think the first panelist spoke about the fact that implementation, and I think in academia we probably may not realize the challenges with implementation, which a lot of public policy has to deal with on a very real, like, I used to think public policy, then when I was in the OPS, there's big P, there's small p, and everybody does different things, and there's program evaluation. And I think in academia, we're taking one bit of it, and we're trying to be, large scale, and a lot of times, like, look at a journal article, you'll have, like, one paragraph of implications. So I think that's something that I feel I do know of in terms, and I think there's a lot also we don't know of the actual workings of how the challenges that people who deal with policy on a day-to-day basis, their challenges in terms of, like, how do they convince people? What do they convince it on? It's also the window of opportunity that was spoken about, right? You can't just say, hey, I like this and this is what we should talk about and this is the only policy. They're priorities, which change with governments, which change with when people leave positions as well. Like, is your work going to be buried deep under? And I think there's a lot of, we need to know, which we don't know and which you don't understand until and unless you've been there.
No.
Yeah.
I'm hearing you guys all express nervousness about engaging directly, either with the media or civil society or governments. Do you, as graduate students, have a discussion about whether you should publish your work in open or closed journals? I've been engaged with the open source software community, and we had a discussion about, and I've read articles since then, about this touches on things that Maurice and Brian said about making data more transparent, making information more transparent. Do you, among your colleagues and your professors, have a discussion about whether your research becomes more accessible to the general public and can therefore engage them if you're publishing in an open journal?
I want to take that question because I was very lucky. During my master's studies, I worked with Structural Genomics Consortium at the Mars building. And the CEO of this organization really believes in open science. So all the professors, including my professor, Dr. Matthew Shapira, adopts this. So the first thing you go into the lab, he has a meeting with you and says, this is a web we have called Open Lab Notebooks. Everything you do in the lab, You're going to have to write in simple language that can be communicated to the public, and we are also going to use open sources to write it in technical term, which I found really difficult and kind of annoying, because I'm like, you're making me write the same thing twice in 2 different languages, but it really served me well. I've heard a lot of people have resistance to this idea of open science, at least in my field, because like it's all about publishing and people worry about other people stealing their work. But I think it's impactful. So we had a blog in a very simple way, like, you know, it can be understood, and you communicate why your science is important, and that's, I think it's science communication. But then that can be a skill translated to different field. I don't know how much of that, like, open data, open source is being done across U of T, but I remember talking to my colleagues in the pharmacology department at the time, and like a lot of my friends and grad students were like, oh, like, I don't think that people like our professor would want the data to be shared or our findings to be going out there. So I feel like there's this sense in academia that you have to keep your work to yourself until you publish. And so, yeah, but like, luckily I was in a lab where it was a different culture. It was open science, like from the get-go, we got to put it out there. We got to make sure we do it 2 ways, to the technical language and also communicate it to the public. So I think it's possible. It's just like a lot of people like don't buy into it.
Yeah, I can add, because I'm actually an open education research fellow, and one of the papers that I'm working on, the condition is it needs to be open access. And then I was like, which journals are open access? I mean, we just know high impact journals, and that's what we look for. And I actually have to do some research, go out, talk to people, talk to my supervisor and say, okay, which journal do I approach that will give everyone the access? One interesting thing that I did find out, and I think I'm correct about this, that in the UK, if I'm the faculty and if I produce a paper, it actually has to be available for public use in some medium or the other. So maybe on the professor's personal website. And I thought that's a great way, and if we could have that here, where any work is sort of, you know, publicly available for anyone to access. It may be a little hard to access, but yeah, I guess these conversations do need to happen. People, I guess it depends on disciplines. Also, some disciplines are competing against each other, so they don't really want to say anything about it or write anything about it until and unless it's out and published and they can get, you know, credit for it. But I think once that happens, definitely you want to, you know, have a version of an article or a blog or a podcast or whatever it is out there to talk about your work because you're proud of it and you're hoping in some way that it makes an impact.
And I guess to answer the question from a slightly different angle, what I try to often represent in my talks, just anywhere, is the phenomenological perspective of being a graduate student. So this is to say the lived experience as a graduate student, not as a part of a giant system with moving pieces, but you know what it's like to wake up or to click on, you know, the SciMago rankings of the journals and search for which publication venue you'd want to publish in. And I know that often, at least for myself, because I don't have data, I do philosophical work and some social science work, but data is not exactly a concern in terms of being open. But the article itself, I do consider whether it should be open access or closed access, but it ends up competing. That consideration ends up competing against, you know, individual aspirations to have, you know, an article in one of the highest ranking journals. And let's say that journal is closed access, then given, you know, let's say a material position in my life where, let's say, you know, I need this CV, you know, line to say this specific thing so that I can get a specific reward in the system that we're in, then it might lose out. Like this kind of overarching altruistic moral consideration, like ends up competing against some of the really individual aspects of being a graduate student. And I'm not saying that's right or that's how it should be. And in fact, I wish it wasn't like that. And I think it's even admitting a bit of defeat in given situations where you're kind of relinquishing your responsibility to others and to the society at large because of pressures that are on you. And so I don't really like that answer, but it's one that I do provide just because I think it's realistic for a lot of graduate students who are in the academy. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, it's the system. Yeah, it's like the incentive again. I think it goes back to your one of your other questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and in saying this, like I don't want to absolve myself of blame or anything like that. I think there is still some culpability in taking these kind of personal aspirations and weighing them higher than a broad societal consideration. But I do think that there are conditions under which that becomes a lot easier to do, and those conditions I think are ones in which we often find ourselves. So I think just kind of continuing our conversation on the panels broadly, one of the things that I don't think we touched on too specifically was the keynote from Glenn Jones. And one of the things that he was mentioning was that there's always an interface between the policy maker and the university faculty, or I guess in our situation it would be us as graduate students. And I think that immediately the thing that struck me was I wonder whether that interface is neutral. Like, what are the different interfaces and their affordances and limitations? So for instance, if I just called up my MP on the phone, that's the interface that I'm working through, right? Like, there's a phone, and that eliminates kind of bodily gestures, that it eliminates being able to see face to face how someone is feeling. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on kind of what you think are effective, or maybe not effective at all, interfaces to kind of getting to public policy, at least from your perspective as graduate students. I can give my answer here first too, just so you have time to think as well. I do think that at least like one of the least effective methods to me has been the conventional methods that you're supposed to use. So for instance, like if there's a website of a given policymaker and it says contact us here, I will almost never contact them there. That you need to find the place where they physically are located and be at that place. So if they're having like a community barbecue or they're having some event of some kind, just make sure you're there. And I think that on one level, like that's strategic, but on another level, like I think it is more genuine that you meet the person where they are most connected. So you show up as a member of the community and not as an email or a phone call that's coming out of nowhere. And I think that's worked well for me in terms of just getting things on agendas of politicians like that are local to myself. And so that's what's worked well for me.
Sorry, my thought is not fully formed in my head. So I think what Carolyn mentioned in the second panel about how in order to make a tangible and significant impact on policy as an academic, you just have to do really excellent academic work, and then that's where you get invited into those spaces where you can make that impact. So I guess that's something to aspire to as like a first year for a PhD student, is to just do really good academic work that actually matters to policymakers, and like I guess that's the kind of impact that I can make in the future. But right now, nothing.
Yeah, so I think that a medium that isn't very helpful when you're trying to reach policymakers is probably like calling your local representative. Like local elected official, I feel like it's not useful at all, because there's so many examples of people clogging up the phones, and we rarely see any kind of change coming out of that. So in addition to being a monk, I work part-time in comms for this small organization that does advocacy in the peer support space. And so one of the ways that we found it super helpful to engage policymakers, for example, when it comes to funding for mental health services, is meeting them face to face. And it won't happen the first time you meet them, it won't happen the second time you meet them. You have to meet them over and over again for it to kind of like click in that this is an issue they should care about. So I think face-to-face is usually the most useful way of doing it, and just recognizing that it's going to take many tries before you can get them to like actually care and actually kind of push for that like policy change.
Yeah, I can say too. I think of two ways. One, go work for them, volunteer for them. I think there are lots of opportunities, and if you, by working for them, you may not have like immediate impact, but you create your network, you create that connection. So when you do have something to say, you know who to reach out to, and the chances are they'll remember you and they actually might acknowledge you. And that's been my experience. So volunteering is another way that you can get access to those spaces, and I think that's part of what Tom said, like our civic engagement as well. The other thing is most, I'll give you the example of the International Education Strategy, which is kind of expires this year, and the new one's gonna come out. There is this 45-day, or there's some period where they will invite community stakeholder participation. And I have the right to go and give my thoughts as a member of the public, saying this is what I think, this is what I feel, and all of that is compiled. And then they'll make a decision one way or the other. But there are ways to engage. There are people who do respond to emails. They may not give you the response that you want, but I've also heard stories where you will get a response, or if not, you'll get a response saying that, because I've drafted a couple of them where we can't help you, but maybe go to this place and they can help you. So there are ways, I do believe that.
Right. I think that does speak a lot to the idea that relationships are key. This was mentioned, I think, across the panels, that building relationships is necessary in order to do effective public policy work. But I think that one thing that I would have liked to hear more about was relationships kind of between faculty members or between people in the academy to build kind of connections across disciplines or across areas in order to do more effective public policy work. Because I know that, for instance, if I was to try to engage in public policy, I know that Mina's faculty does that, significantly more than my own, right? And so I think leveraging the capacities there would be at least, helpful to me. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing, in your various faculties and departments, like whether there are opportunities for kind of strength building in doing public policy work, and where you would like to see that. Like if you were to try to build a relationship that you thought would help you do public policy work better, like what would that look like for you? Would it be other graduate students? Would it be reaching out to professors? What's the picture?
I think all of the examples I'm going to give you is going to be in the health and medical. I'm sorry. This is just what I've studied. So I think, I would envision something that engages us as students, even at a student level. And they do that sometimes with our training. They get us in rooms with like other students who are in health sciences, whether it's like dentistry, nursing, also social work. So they try to create conversation between us, but it's usually like oriented towards like a specific case for a patient. But I think like that, wouldn't that be great if like we start talking together as trainees across different faculties and about the health issues or the health policy problems that we're facing, or the health system issues. So I would envision something like that. And maybe there is something like that that I don't know about, but nothing that is like implemented in the program or training. There's interprofessional components to our training, but I think it's more geared towards what can we learn from the doctors, what can we learn from the nurses, or like so on and so forth. I would envision for my faculty to engage with like the public health faculty Dalai Lama, which I know our professors do. Actually, our faculty is really great in that sense. There's a lot of work being done in collaboration with faculties like in nursing from the Dalai Lama Public School of Public Health. They do work with like professors across. But I don't know if that necessarily leads to better engagement with public policy. I would envision so, because then you have a bigger network and your research, the breadth of your work is greater, so you have more capacity and more funding to pool to answer some questions. And Mina, for example, today that was here, the other Mina, Dr. Tadros, he does that. So he works with people across the university. And I think that's actually one of the reasons that, I think it's necessary. Like if you're just like doing silo work, like it's gonna be really hard, I think, to be in this space. You really need to collaborate, have a great network, have conversations with like people from different spaces, yeah.
Yeah, I think so too, and especially at the Faculty of Education, OISE, I think there are a lot of opportunities for doing that kind of work, and I'm thinking specifically about something that Maurice said when he was talking about policymakers kind of having learning styles. He didn't use those words specifically, but he kind of implied that some of them might be visual learners, some of them might be auditory learners, like that kind of thing. And to me, like this whole conference has been like resituating public policy as education work, in the idea that the public servants are often or the public service is often educating ministers and doing this educating in briefing notes. And so I'm thinking about how we could leverage the skills in teaching at the education faculty to reconceptualize public policy skills, to re-articulate teaching as a public policy skill, and to loop in like teachers, because at OISE we have a huge amount of access to professional teachers, and I think teachers' voices are often unheard in the public policy arena, precisely because I think teaching is perhaps not articulated as a skill that could be used for policy advocacy, and so that's at least my answer to the question.
Okay, so I don't know if you're looking at me or if you're just looking at...
It's just anyone over there.
Well, I will start off by saying that university professors aren't trained to be teachers. So that has something to say about... No, I mean, some are, to be fair, but a lot of times is learning on the job. And they do learn how to... best practices in terms of like writing. But again, I'm thinking about the fact that academic writing and what we are taught in terms of a skill set is different, maybe to what the policymakers need. And I'll tell you, the first time I spoke to my manager in the OPS, and she was like, don't write academically, whatever you do. And that was and she'd never seen me write. I've never seen anything that I'd written. And I was like, no problem, I can handle that. But I guess there's this perception that we come with a skill set that we need to unlearn. But I do think where teaching can help is like how to develop your argument, how to be succinct, in an abstract of 150 words or less. And that can definitely be maybe a focus on the skills. Because if you see, we aren't really taught that in our regular coursework. Because our coursework focuses on the subject matter, whichever, it could be power and politics or whatever it is. But these skills we pick up from other places or through own. So yeah, definitely, it'd be nice if that happens, and then we can contribute. And also, I think another thing is that what do we learn from policymakers? It's not just academia, doing the work, but what are the issues that they want us to think about? And how can we lend, not me, but how can academia lend its expertise to them?
So I think, kind of taking us from the moral obligation to the expanding role of the universities, to the interfaces that Glenn Jones was mentioning, and now to the kind of learning styles, at least that I mentioned of Maurice, that kind of takes us through the entire conference as a whole. And so I'm wondering whether there were themes anyone else kind of noticed or wanted to talk about before we perhaps close.
One thing that stood out to me from the third panel was it Maurice? I think it was Maurice. He mentioned, oh no, it was David Simmer. He mentioned that academics should call out BS more often. Oh, it was Brian, sorry about that. I just named everyone on the panel except him. But yeah, academics should call out BS more often. And that really stood out to me, and I think kind of served as a call to action for me, and emphasizing the role of academics in public policy, and that there's a role for people who kind of understand data and evidence to really speak on the issues, because it's typically people who have some kind of partisan position or some kind of self-interested position that typically speak on these kinds of issues. So I was kind of weighing that with what Glenn was saying about the politicization of your research and being kind of afraid of how your research would be misconstrued in the media. So I'm kind of grappling with that theme throughout our time here. But yeah, that was something I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I can end by saying that I think Maurice made this remark about universities haven't changed sitting in this room. I will say, but the people who are in universities who comes to universities. And that puts you in a position where the university is representative of this diversity and this body of students. And I think it would be a missed opportunity if it couldn't use its skill set and its expertise with towards engaging with public policy, hoping for wider impact. So I think that was my learning from these.
I think it ties back to what Peter Lowen said at the beginning, that universities need to prove their worth in society.
They have to, but they've managed to be gatekeepers of knowledge for many years. So that's another. But you're right, they do, and I think they're in a position where they can, because they just represent so much.
Yeah.
Did anyone else want to say anything before we close?
Something that Maurice brought up was super interesting, which is we're talking about, linkages between academia and public policy, and he was like, well, you have to remember the third party here, which is like the public, and that was super interesting to me. And with the public, something that he brought up a few times during the panel was this erosion of trust in academia and in science and even in like public policy and in politicians. That was super interesting, and I didn't know how to like grapple with that, because I was thinking like, even if academia and like public policy, even if there's better collaboration and there's like it becomes a well-oiled machine, none of it matters if like the people don't believe in like what's being put out there. So that was I was thinking about that quite a bit.
Thank you. And Setayesh, did you want to say anything at the end?
I think the last panel was it. Yeah, like the skills for us and what we can, it was your question about what do you have for the students. So I think that's like the main message I'm taking away is what can I do right now? And if I want to appear on the policy and maybe in 10 years, I'm, who knows, maybe all of us in policy. So what can I do now? And I was like, you know what? I can work on building my communication skills, like very practical aspects that I can take away from today was be able to communicate, right? Am I able to concisely, if somebody who's not in my field, can I communicate with them? Why is this important? So I think I have a lot of things, a homework to do with today's, the things that I've learned. So that's the main one for me, the takeaway.
And I think what all of those reflections do nicely is speak to the theme of this symposium, which seemed to be piecing together the various, the arena, the public policy arena, because that's not something that we discussed specifically, but it's something that kind of emerged over the course of the various sessions. So thinking about the academy, the government, the public, and then what are the linkages between them, and then the specific materiality of what it's like to be a minister, for instance, or what it's like to be a public servant. I think that'll help to flesh it out for me, and I think has given me a lot of questions. But it also, I think, points towards strength building between all of those various different pieces that I think will be a helpful path forward. So with that, I think we're going to conclude, and thank you all for coming.